On the 7th October attack in Israel and Israel's subsequent military operation in Gaza have not occurred in a vacuum. They were preceded by decades of violence and retribution, dispossession, unlawful occupation, and denial of the Palestinians' right to self-determination. International law has strict and clear regulations on the conduct of war and the conduct of self-defense, a fundamental principle of international law which underscored our findings is that unlawful action by one party to an armed conflict does not justify unlawful action by another party. Israel has a right to protect its citizens from violence by Palestinian armed groups, but in doing so, it must comply with international law. Hamas and the Palestinian armed group must also comply with international law. In relation to Israel's military operations and attacks in Gaza from 7th October, we conclude that Israeli authorities are responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law, including extermination, intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, murder or willful killing, using starvation as a method of war, forcible transfer, gender persecution targeting Palestinian men and boys, sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture, and cruel or inhuman treatment. Israel's total siege of the Gaza Strip has weaponized the provision of life-sustaining necessities for strategic and political gains, including through cutting off supplies of water, food, electricity, fuel, and other essential supplies, including humanitarian assistance. It constitutes collective punishment, disproportionately impacting pregnant women and persons with disabilities, and is causing grave harm to children, including starvation-related deaths. We found that the immense numbers of civilian casualties in Gaza and widespread destruction of civilian objects and infrastructure were the inevitable result of an intentional strategy to cause maximum damage, disregarding the legal obligations of distinction, proportionality, and adequate precautions. Israel also forcibly transferred almost the entire population into small enclosures that are unsafe and uninhabitable. The deliberate use of heavy weapons with large destructive capacity in densely populated areas constitutes an intentional and direct attack on the civilian population. Although Israeli officials have repeatedly stated that their operations in Gaza are intended to destroy Hamas and to release hostages, yet neither of these aims has been largely achieved at the expense of thousands of lives. We found that Israeli forces committed sexual and gender-based violence with the intent to humiliate and further subordinate the Palestinian community. Palestinian women were targeted and subjected to sexual violence and harassment online and in person. Men and boys experienced specific persecutory acts, including sexual and gender-based violence amounting to torture and inhuman and cruel treatment. The Commission concluded that specific forms of sexual and gender-based violence constitute part of Israeli security forces' operating procedures. The situation in the Gaza Strip has overshadowed that in the West Bank, where Palestinian fatalities recorded since 7th October have exceeded any other recorded period. This is linked to increasingly militarized Israeli operations, a trend which we highlighted in our report to the General Assembly last year, as well as a surge in violent settler attacks on Palestinian communities, often assisted or condoned by Israeli forces. The blatant disregard for international law across the entire occupied Palestinian territory has disproportionately impacted Palestinian children. In Gaza, Israeli security forces have killed and maimed tens of thousands of children, and thousands more likely remain under the rubble. Israeli attacks have also severely impacted infrastructure essential for the well-being of children, including hospitals, schools, and basic services.
The Israeli army is the most moral army in the world. This is something that is said repeatedly by the current Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu. On one recent occasion, he walked it back a bit and he said one of the most moral armies in the world. Now, I don't have the expertise and I don't have the authority to make assessments of morality. Netanyahu may, but I don't. So, I don't know whether it's one of the most moral armies in the world or not. But what I do have expertise in and what I do have an authority to do is make assessments of criminal conduct. And we've done that in relation to the recent events, and you can see that in the report. And the only conclusion you can draw is that the Israeli army is one of the most criminal armies in the world.